So we're now definitely supposed to be in session 2. So let me just quickly share again the PowerPoint slide. Is it appearing? It's loading, loading. It says. Can you see it? What can you see now?
The Gospels, who, when, and why.
Yeah. Okay. So part 2. So part 2 now we're going to get to know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Sounds good. So I've got the quote from Ezekiel, and a lot of you will be aware of this kind of flavour, but it's a useful way of just introducing the 4 Gospels. It's not the history, it's more the kind of perhaps the meaning. So the quote from Ezekiel, so as I watched, I noticed a windstorm coming from the north, an enormous cloud with lightning flashes, and in the fire where they looked were 4 living beings, and in their appearance was human form, but each had 4 faces and 4 wings, and their faces had the appearance, each had the face of a man, of a lion, an ox, and of an eagle. And you go on, I think, and he refers to them again. The first was a creature like a lion, the second was like a calf, or an ox in other words, the third was like a man, and the fourth was a flying eagle. Now, to put it in context, what's happening here is Ezekiel has been born in Jerusalem at the time when it's coming under a wave of sieges, and he has been taken out of Jerusalem and he's been deported to Babylon. And as he sits by the rivers of Babylon, kind of humming that Boney M song to himself as he sits there, he has this vision of wheels within wheels, and we know the thing, it's all very graphic. But the thing we often miss, because it's so graphic, and we love to kind of imagine the LSD trip he's having at this time, is that he sees the presence of God leaving Jerusalem and going by the same route. But it doesn't actually say that. It describes the route, but it's the same route that he was deported from Jerusalem to Babylon in. And in this vision, what's happening is that God is leaving the temple and he is going out into the world, because actually this deportation, taking Ezekiel out of Jerusalem, taking him to Babylon, and then to Assyria and then Babylon, is there's a series of deportations and empires emerged that kept mixing the world population up, because it's the way that an empire works. When it takes over a territory, you move people around so that they can't band together and work together to overthrow you again. So we have a series of empires come along and they mix people up. But as Ezekiel is looking at it, he sees God leaving Jerusalem and kind of spreading therefore across the whole world with those who are being forcibly taken. Does that make sense? And in that context, he sees the presence of God being carried by creatures that represent, with the 4 faces, there's an element there's a human element to them because they've got the face of a man. There is a kind of a kingly element because they have the face of a lion. There is a kind of a sacrifice and service element because they have the face of an ox. Because you can sacrifice an ox or you can make it work for you. So sacrifice and service. And there's a kind of divine element because one has a face of an eagle. Does that make sense? And so for a very long time, the early church recognized there's probably something of this in the 4 Gospels. There's an image there from a church that someone took on holiday for me after I'd taught this once. They took the photo of it. The Catholic Church probably gets them in the wrong order, but I've got a little table there that shows different early church fathers how they saw this. I think with the advantages of modern kind of with the fact we can reproduce the gospel so freely and we can read them all side by side, we would now say that there is a kind of a sense in which Matthew's gospel gives us a kingly view of Jesus. So if we're trying to get to know Jesus, you see, we know Jesus by the Spirit because he lives in us. But the ascended Jesus is so vast that I can't tell the shape. You notice that if you're feeling out, into the ascended Jesus, he fills up everything. So I can't ever find the edges and I can't get the shape. So to understand the shape of Jesus, we come to the Gospels, the written record. And as we come to them, they give us these 4 perspectives. And so we have in Matthew gives us the kingly perspective. And so Matthew's Gospel, for instance, I said we're going to introduce the Gospel writer, so I do what it says on the slide here. Matthew himself, he works for the empire. He is a case. So I think of the Empire Strikes Back right now and all that kind of analogy. But he is an agent of the empire. He's Jewish, but he has sold himself to tax collection on behalf of Caesar. So he is a civil servant working for the empire, and so it's not surprising. Even in his, if you like, in his real life job, he kind of reflects this kind of royal view. And so he starts his gospel with Jesus' kingly lineage that goes back to David, if you remember, and it carries the kind of lineage for kingship. And he's full of fulfilled prophecy, because kings have an important role and they've been prophesied. And so he gives us a very kind of clear sense of Jesus as the messianic king. Mark's gospel, Mark is speaking on behalf of Peter. That's what we're told. We're going to look at the quotes in a bit to see where it comes from. We're told that he's recording Peter's preaching, and Peter, of course, is a tradesman. We don't know much about Mark as a person, but the person who he's recording, the person who's speaking the gospel, is Peter, who's a tradesman, which kind of fits that ox face. And in Mark's gospel, you don't have a genealogy because nobody cares about servants. Actually, Mark's gospel declares itself according to Isaiah, the gospel according to Isaiah, and Isaiah, his big figure is the suffering servant. So you get this service sense out of Mark's gospel. So Matthew's saying the gospel, you get a sense of Jesus the King, and the things. Of course, they're recording the same events, but it's the way they record it and draw out certain elements. For instance, in Matthew's gospel, when Jesus healed people, he just says that, and Jesus healed him. Jesus healed him, because you don't get any effort from a king. If a king wins a war somewhere, he didn't actually swing a sword, but he still wins it. Does that make sense? when we read Mark's gospel and we hear about Jesus healing people, it doesn't just say he healed them. It says, a man came to him, was brought to him, and Jesus takes him away from the crowd and spits on the ground and makes mud and puts it on his eyes and asks him a question. And we have much more of the sense of the work that's involved. So in Mark's gospel, we're kind of getting that ox view, the sacrifice and service view. John's gospel, of course, is very obviously giving us that kind of divine view, the God's eye view, the eagle's view. So we start in eternity. Mark's gospel starts with royal history. Mark's gospel starts in the wilderness with ignominy, no lineage, just kind of bang, Jesus is coming to do stuff. John's gospel starts in eternity because he's giving us that kind of divine view. And Luke's gospel starts in family history. It starts with Jesus' humanity. His mother and his father, and his mother's got a relative who's Elizabeth, and they've got family and they've got hopes and aspirations. And actually, as we go through Luke's gospel, we have a sense of Jesus the man, with his family connections, with his friends. So we get more of Jesus' friends and family in Luke than any of the other Gospels. Does that make sense? You kind of got that flavour. And I always find it's a really helpful one to see. It's not the majority where we're going. I can't remember now whether I left these in your notes or whether I've just got them on slides here. I'm going to skip through them as slides, but I got a whole load of things, different ways that you can look at the four Gospels and see, the kind of kingly relationship or the service relationship. But I don't want to spend too much time on it, so I'm going to kind of skim through them. Here we go, and we'll come to now. So let's start with Matthew. So, I'm just remembering, hopefully I'm recording. I did say I was recording, didn't I?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Matthew's Gospel, as I said, historically we've grown up in a context where we think of Mark coming first. Once you see the importance of Matthew's Gospel, I hope you'll get this sense of why it's so key. If I was to ask, and you can give me some feedback, so, I asked the question earlier, what does Matthew do? You think about the Gospel stories, most disciples, there's a story about something that they do. Not quite everyone, but, Philip comes out and says, it costs this much to buy bread. You get that kind of thing. Matthew doesn't do anything. But here's an interesting thing. Matthew's call, okay, so you think about the call of the disciples, and we don't have the call of all of them recorded. We have the four fishermen. We have Nathaniel, who's probably Bartholomew as well, Nathaniel and Bartholomew. We have Philip's call. So we have the call of some of them. Matthew's call is bigger than all of the rest put together. Okay, so I want to stop and think about that. You may not realise it. because we think of Jesus goes past him, sees him at the tax office, says, "Follow me." But it doesn't stop there, because it says that then Jesus goes back to his home, and then people start to gather to the home and they start to debate with Jesus and ask questions. And so Matthew's call actually takes up a couple of chapters. And you add them across the three synoptic gospels. If you add up the verses that in the New Testament are given to Matthew's call, it's more than the rest of them put together. Why? Is the question. And the answer, I think, is as we'll see as we get to the story of the early churches, Matthew he's not an accidental gospel writer. It seems that right from the beginning he has a key function and a key role, and we're building this picture slightly from information from outside the gospels, but it fits with what the gospels tell us. Hang on, let's just run through. The first thing is, you will often see in commentaries that in Matthew's Gospel, where Matthew is called from the tax office, in Mark and Luke, he's called Levi. And you'll see in those commentaries, they say that probably Matthew and Levi, the call of Matthew was bolted onto the call of someone called Levi, and they're not the same people, because there's no reason why someone called Levi would also be called Matthew. That's the logic. Now, let me explain that a little bit. Because this is a really fascinating, well, I think it's fascinating anyway. We know a huge amount now about naming conventions in Jesus' day. And the habit of calling after an uncle is really key, which is, remember, when John the Baptist is born, they say, "Why do you call him John? No one in your family is called John." John is actually a really common name, so it's an odd thing to say. What they mean is that there are conventions for naming, and it's not being followed here. It's been given a common name, it's not a naming convention. Now, part of that convention is most people have at least two names, and if you're Roman, you have probably three. And the key thing is, if you have a really common name, of which Levi is a really common name, you have some marker that is not so common, which might be, the marker might be from where you've come from. It might be an alternative name, a family name, etc. So the logic goes like this. The reason why it's confusing is because if Matthew is thought to be based on the name Matthias, or Matithia, that's it, Matithia, and it's almost as common as Levi. The two are pretty common. So why give someone who's got a common name an identifying name that's just as common? Do you see the problem? But it's not quite as simple as that, because actually one of the things, it's a slightly odd way of saying Matithia. Matithios it is. And if you look in the Old Testament, normally the name Matithia is kind of straightforward. Occasionally there's someone called Matithios. And one of those people is really interesting, and this is, this might make you think I'm a very sad person, but for about 4 years it bugged me why Levi should be called Matthew when they're both common names. I know that probably doesn't keep you awake at night, but for someone trying to understand the history of it, it really bugged me. And I was actually walking my dogs one day, and I suddenly had this thought, and I went home and checked it out, and it actually matches up. And so I'm, on a personal level, because I've got personal investment, I'm now convinced of this. That if you look up the name Matithios, you find it's used of a couple of people in the Old Testament. One is with David. He's a worship leader. I don't think that's anything to do with Matthew. The other, though, is a scribe who stands at the right hand of Ezra when he first stands up, and they kind of reinstate the place of Scripture in the Old Testament in the Second Temple. So if you go and you read the account in the book of Ezra, he stands up, and it says, "And to his right stands Matthew." Okay? Now, do you remember when I said earlier, that is the period that gives us the Old Testament. It's the foundation of the Old Testament as we have it. That doesn't mean to say that there weren't things before that, but the way they've come to us was put together at that period under Ezra and the scribes of that temple. So I actually think that this is another nickname. Jesus loves giving nicknames to his disciples. You're Simon, I'm going to call you Peter. You're James and John, we're going to call you Boanerges. You see the... And one of the things we now know is that nicknames are a very common way of marking somebody out. So I think that actually what Jesus has done here, and we're going to think about, because we now know a lot about the training of tax collectors. We get the information, not from Palestine, but from but from Egypt. But the empire's training will be pretty similar in every place. And we're going to see that Matthew has a unique set of skills. And I think that Jesus therefore very consciously calls Matthew, he's called Levi, he gives him the nickname Matthew, because that character who stands next to Ezra, and who was therefore one of the scribes, and therefore probably a key part of putting the Old Testament together, not only that, but he also has failed in life, because he's also included in the book of Ezra as someone who's married a foreign wife and has to repent. And Matthew, of course, is someone who's sold out to the Roman Empire and is kind of considered, therefore, to have a covenant with a Gentile. Does that make sense? And so you kind of see a parallel in this Old Testament character with it. If Matthew is the nickname that Jesus has given Levi, it is perhaps to recognize his role. And in that call period, when he first calls Matthew from the tax booth and he gives a meal, all his friends are there, and people are starting to debate, Jesus first talks about, and when I'm not here, but my disciples are. It's the first time he ever says anything about one day I won't be here, but these guys will. So right from the very beginning, when Jesus meets Matthew, the context and conversation is going to be when I'm not around. Do you see that? So what I'm kind of presenting is there's a possibility that by being led by the Spirit, how conscious it was to Jesus in his head and how much it was a heart-led thing, I'm going to say I think that Matthew is being selected very specifically to be a key character in the delivery to us of the story of Jesus. And now we look at Matthew's training as a tax collector, and what we know is that he's trained in shorthand. So he is trained with the materials, which in the ancient world included kind of foldable wax tablets. And what you did is you had a metal stylus, your wax tablets, and tax collectors, of course, are not popular. They have to go into a household, because taxes in the Roman world were based on households, not individuals. And a household is quite a big, complex thing. Actually, the English word economics comes from the Greek word for a household, oikonomia. So the tax collector had to go into the oikonomia, and he had to ask questions about the various forms of income that the household has. And he had to assign it according to the numbers of the people and so on. And so he's going in modern terms, it's into a hostile environment. So he is doing an interrogation rather than taking a statement. If you just take a statement, they'll lie to you. So you have to interrogate them, ask questions. So the tax collector has to make shorthand notes while he interviews hostile witnesses about their taxes. He then takes his wax tablets away. He takes them, he gets back home and he makes notes with them. He moves them around and reorganizes them so he can see flaws in the story. Then he goes back. Then he has to collate and write in Greek. So he's made notes in whatever the language is. So if it was in Egypt, it would be in Egyptian. If it's in Syria, it would be in Syrian. Here he is, probably Matthew is making notes in Aramaic on his wax tablets. He then goes home and has to kind of transfer those to paper and rearrange them, juggle them around. He then has to produce a report for the next stage up from those notes. Can you see how relevant that is to getting the gospel story and the teaching of Jesus out? You see that? And so the position I'm presenting to you right up front, which is not just a kind of fantasy pulled from the air, but you're not likely to find talked out, is that there has been that Matthew has a very distinct role within the disciples. And actually, we're going to see in a minute, we're actually told by the early church, it's slightly ambiguous the way it's said, but that he took down the teaching of Jesus. Now, does it mean that he did it later, or did it mean while Jesus is teaching, he's making notes on his wax tablet? Which actually makes sense of what we know his training is. Does that make sense? So, I'm going to skip over this. I think, I can't remember whether I left this in your notes or whether it's on my PowerPoint slides. I had a comparison of the styles of Matthew and Mark. If you've got them in your notes, because of time, I don't want to spend too much time on detail that not everyone will be interested in. But the illustrations I've got there, as you run through, is to show that Matthew gives us kind of generic statements about Jesus, which is why they're quite short statements, but he gives us a lot more of them. Mark gives us all the eyewitness detail. And as we're going to see, the early church, their understanding is that Matthew has written for use in the church, whereas Mark has written and captured how Peter preached it. So that would explain why Matthew and Mark, their stories look very, very similar, except that in Matthew they're kind of generic versions of the story, whereas in Mark they're kind of the eyewitness preacher kind of, and we did this, and this is how it went, and this is what he looked like, this is how he smelt, and all those kind of details, they come from Mark's gospel, which is a capturing of Peter preaching the agreed story that Matthew's already written. So I've got some of the, I may have put those into your notes. I can't remember now whether they're there or not, but I'm going to skip through these for the sake of speed. So here we go. Here's Papias, who said, again, born around 60 AD, lived till about 130. He's quoted by Eusebius. Here we've got Matthew compiled the reports in a Hebrew dialect, but each interpreted them as they could. So until, remembering last session, until Jean Carmignac actually established that Hebrew was quite common within kind of the religious communities, i.e. the synagogues and so on, everybody assumed that that was a mistake. It wasn't Hebrew, it was Aramaic, and that's probably what he meant. But you see, that's part of what undermines the testimony, because they thought, well, he's wrong, it's not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. Now there are many scholars who say actually it seems that Hebrew was being spoken, a form of Hebrew at that stage, and was taught in the synagogue, so from a very early age. Even if you spoke Aramaic in the marketplace, as soon as you went to the synagogue you were speaking Hebrew, you see. So we have this testimony that Matthew was the one that compiled the reports from Papias. He sources his knowledge to a couple of guys, John the Elder and Aristion, who interestingly, I'm going to say it now because I'll probably forget it later, there's an ancient manuscript of Mark's Gospel, and you know how sometimes people talk about the ending because it seems to have been bolted on? Has anyone heard that before? The end of Mark's Gospel, after chapter 16, verse 9, the Gospel kind of has an ending there, and then there's a kind of an extra bit of an ending. And some Gospels don't have the extra ending at all, they just stop at verse 9. And there is actually an ancient manuscript that has the extra ending, but it's marked in the thing as being added by Aristion, who's actually the character who's here. It's just interesting to note. And who we just so in case you wonder who he is, he's one of the 72. So if you've ever seen that, where people say, where should Mark end? Does it end at verse 9, or does it go on to verse 16? I think it is. He probably finished it rather abruptly, because actually that's where Peter would then go into making an appeal, you know. So that's the story now, appeal. And at some point Aristion has added, and Aristion was a disciple of Jesus, one of the 72. That's probably the logic. That's a bit of an aside. Hopefully it's not too confusing. Irenaeus says of Matthew that Matthew composed his gospel among the Hebrews, so he's composing it while still in Jerusalem, in their own language, you see, while Peter and Paul proclaimed the gospel in Rome and founded the community. Then he uses and says after their death, but the word he uses is actually their departure, and that's one of these little confusing moments, because Peter first goes to Rome in the 40s and then comes back, and he goes backwards and forwards several times. So after departure could be several places. After his death is the late 60s, you see. After their death or departure, Mark the disciple, an interpreter, handed on the preaching in written form, which doesn't mean he hadn't written it before then. He's just saying that even when they weren't around anymore, we still got it because of Mark. So this is Irenaeus speaking. This one I like. You probably never heard of him. I hadn't really until I started reading around these kind of things. Pantaeus, Pantaeus went to the Indians, so he gets out to India. The Roman province of India covers more than we think of just as India now, but it's that kind of region. And the tradition is that he found there among them some who had known Christ. And the gospel, according to Matthew, had preceded his coming and had come with Bartholomew, and he had left them the gospel of Matthew in Hebrew letters. So here we are at the end of the 2nd century. We're having a testimony to someone who's gone as a missionary to India, got there, discovered that the gospel already got there. It was brought by Bartholomew, and not only that, they have Matthew's gospel, but in India it still exists in its Hebrew form. Pantaeus would have bought it in its Greek form, you see. You see the story as it's developing. And it goes on to say that he brought that version back to Alexandria, which is interesting because we read about people discovering the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew in Alexandria. So we have from a guy called Epiphanes, who's a bishop of Salamis. He's referring to the Ebionites and the Nazareans, have the Gospel according to Matthew complete but in Hebrew. In Greek, the word and but are the same. So there it says complete and in Hebrew. I've made it but to give it more drama. Complete, but it's in Hebrew. And so he's writing now in the current. So although he's a bit later, he's saying actually they've still got it. They've still got the Hebrew version of Matthew. So he mentions the Nazareans, which interestingly corroborates another testimony. Because we read in Jerome, who's even later. So Jerome says Matthew was the first to compose a gospel in Hebrew. Further, the Hebrew, this is Jerome, is preserved to this present day in the library at Caesarea, and I had leave given to me to copy it by the Nazareans of Berea. So Jerome's Nazareans are probably Epiphanes' Nazoreans. It's just different ways of saying the same thing. So what Jerome is saying, although he's at the end of the 3rd century, he's saying that actually when I was there, I actually saw this gospel. So he's not saying I heard a report that hundreds of years ago this existed. He's saying I actually saw it, and not only that, I've copied it out. So he's not, unless he's totally making it up, he really has seen a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. Does that make sense? So you see what I'm saying by this story is that Matthew wrote first, and he wrote it in Hebrew before it becomes Greek. As I say, 20th century scholarship, of course, rejected the idea of an Aramaic or Hebrew original for Matthew's Gospel. They felt that the Greek version didn't show signs of having been of being translated, which is a telltale kind of grammatical thing. And that's why I say John Carminiak's work was so key, because what he actually showed is that even the Greek reflects underlying Aramaic grammar. And that's the kind of thing you don't know unless you spend your whole life, like Carminiak did, reading stuff in Greek and Aramaic. You know, if you've just been taught the words, you don't see that underlying grammatical structure. And so he was able to demonstrate that. Now, there's an interesting little extra here, just in case anyone's... In the 14th century, so we're going back a bit, that's considerably after Jesus, obviously, but considerably before us, there were a number of Hebrew texts of the Gospel of Matthew suddenly emerged. And they emerged within the Jewish population. And at the time, Christianity and Judaism were really in conflict. But it became apparent because a number of Christian scholars became aware of copies of Matthew's Gospel written in Hebrew that was being used by the Jewish community, normally to understand Christians who they were then rejecting. Does that make sense? So there were a number of these, and the best of which is one that's referred to as Evan Bohan, which means the touchstone. The touchstone was an anti-Christian polemic, and in it includes the entire text of Matthew's Gospel, in a form that is almost the same as the Greek, but is a little bit different. And it raises a question, because if it was a direct translation from the Greek into Hebrew, you would expect it to be pretty much exactly the same. So, for instance, if I give you the kind of difference, in Evan Bohan, there are only 6 Beatitudes, whereas in our Greek version of Matthew, there are 8. Does that make sense? But you can imagine, because as we're going to look at next week, if Matthew is responsible, because he writes in both Hebrew and he writes in Greek, if he is responsible for writing the Greek version as well as the Hebrew, when he gets to it, he might think, you know, I thought of a couple of other things and squeeze them in. It's that kind of thing. So it makes less sense to take them out if you're copying the gospel, but you could understand if in the next wave, the next generation as it comes out in Greek, they get added. So if anyone's interested, you can actually buy the thing on Amazon. I'm not suggesting you necessarily do, because you can actually see it's very unhelpfully. I say unhelpfully. It's written in Hebrew, although there's a translation on the other side. I don't read Hebrew easily, but I am stubborn enough that I have gone through some of this text to kind of find things, and it's kind of because I'm interested sometimes in the words that you use and so on. So what we're actually saying is that while there are plenty out there academics saying it's far too late, we should dismiss it, it's not what we're talking about. Its provenance does sort of like imply that even if the Hebrew has been updated to be modern European, or I say modern, medieval Hebrew rather than first century Palestinian, it looks like that there was a version of Matthew that existed within the Jewish community for a long time, which is probably what gives rise to the various versions that were found, of which is thought the most complete and best one. You can now buy the text and you can buy the translation from it. So there is evidence, you see, that what the early church was saying is true. Of course, it's dismissed by an awful lot of people. Oh, there's a picture of it in my. I've got a quick note on this kind of the thing of Aramaisms or Hebraisms that you do get in Matthew's Gospel. For instance, in Matthew 1, you could imagine how if this was originally written in Hebrew, then translated into Greek, it would come out like this, but not the other way around. So in Matthew 1:21, the angel says, "You shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins." Now, if you're reading in Greek and Jesus is not a famous person at the point the Gospel is written, that would make no sense to you whatsoever. He's called Jesus, and he's going to save the people because he's going to save the people from their sins. You don't speak Hebrew, you don't speak Aramaic, you don't know that the name Jesus means saviour or salvation. Do you see what I'm saying? You'd expect it to explain it, but it doesn't. Which kind of points to the fact that originally it was written in Hebrew, where it makes total sense, because basically it says, you should call his name Yeshua because he will Yoshua his people. And that's obvious. You can see why now. Do you see what I'm saying? You get things like that go right the way through Matthew's Gospel. It seems like the idea that it was written in Hebrew and then got translated, and I think by the same person, by the same Matthew, he produces a Greek version as the church grows bigger, but the original is there in Hebrew. I'm wondering how much detail to get into, because I don't want to bore people with linguistic things. It's useful for you to see they're there. Maybe not necessarily. The thing I've got here is is that in the Greek of Matthew's Gospel, it doesn't say the kingdom of heaven. It says the kingdom of heavens. And that represents a really very Hebrew way of writing, because often they didn't want to say the kingdom of God, so they substitute it with the word heaven. But in Hebrew, the word heaven is a plural word. So actually, if you wrote it first in Hebrew, you would say the kingdom of heavens, the kingdom of heavens. When you then translate it into Greek, you might keep that, even though in Greek, normally heaven is a singular word. And as it turns out, the Greek of Matthew's Gospel has the kingdom of heavens. So that's a rather technical, but does that sort of make sense? What I'm trying to drive at is there are these evidences in Matthew's Gospel that it started as a Hebrew document. It doesn't 100% prove it, but it's kind of all evidence that builds up to say it does look like that, which is what the early church tells us. I've got a comment here on the use of the Hebrew word for then, because Matthew's Gospel uses the word then all the time, which is a common word in Aramaic and Hebrew, but doesn't quite mean the same as it does in English. In English and in Greek, then means in close proximity of time, whereas then in Hebrew and Aramaic means in proximity of idea. So if I say so and so was batting really well, then so was Ian Botham in the 1980s. You know, the proximity of the word then is of ideas, batting in cricket, not of time. Whereas when we use then, we tend to mean this is going on, then this happened. Does that make sense? And Matthew does that all the way through. He's using the word then just as often he's using it to kind of tie ideas together as he does to tie things chronologically. So these are just some technical little bits. So the story you get from the early church is that Matthew was there and he actually takes down in Hebrew. He was the first to compile in Hebrew. He distributed it. It got used. It did get translated at some point. There is a testimony to say that there was that there was an existing version of Hebrew in the first few centuries. Once people have got more used to Matthew, and we actually have a copy of a Hebrew document that goes back to the medieval period, which claims is kind of an older descent right the way back. So, and we look through the text of Hebrew, we see Aramaeans and Aramaic frames and Hebrew kind of nuances, and we look at the training that is possible for the training that was required of a tax gatherer, which is about note taking, transferring notes, collating reports, and kind of creating arguments and structuring things well. And so actually they all look like they fit together pretty well. And then we saw that thing where actually Matthew is chosen seems very early on, and he is put in the context the first time Jesus talks about when his disciples are there and he's not. Matthew is actually, that actually happens at Matthew's house when Jesus first says that. So, and that actually Matthew's name is Levi, but he gets given the same name of the guy that stood next to Ezra as a scribe, who was a key, therefore effectively like Ezra's right hand man to get the Old Testament written. Do you see how all those things are beginning to fit together? I don't. As someone who, I never got told this. I kind of worked. I discovered it, if I put it that way. I actually kind of used to get these little chills when you go, "Oh, that makes sense. That really does make sense," if you see what I mean. But anyway, we'll come on to Mark. So then, what happens with Mark? Mark, we find out he's known, of course, as John Mark. I say, of course, it's not as obvious, but right from the early church, they recognise John Mark and Mark as the same person, except for a couple of later testimonies. He's therefore, John Mark is part of the very first missionary team. So thinking about their role in the New Testament, the very first missionary team, the Holy Spirit helps choose Barnabas and Paul, and then they say, John Mark, can you come with us? Do you remember? He's part of a key family in the Jerusalem church, and according to he may have been the young man in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's as I say, his family is the house when Peter comes along. Peter has been put in prison, and there's the earthquake, and he escapes. So what we forget is he is now a man on the run. So when he says, "Right, I'm off," it's not kind of like I'm just being difficult and obtuse, and I'm going to leave you to deal with the thing. It's actually he can't really stay in Jerusalem. And he says, "I'm leaving," and it says there he left for another place. He says that actually at John Mark's house. And so although we're not told it, it's possible that John Mark goes with him on his first trip out. And as we're going to see, that early church tradition, I say we're going to see, I don't think I put it here, but early church tradition is unanimous when it says that actually he goes right straight to Rome. Now, we don't read about that in the book of Acts, but that's because Acts was written by Luke, who follows Paul. But Paul does say, when he writes to the Romans, "I'd like to come and see you, but I don't want to build on somebody else's foundation." Do you remember that? And that's you see a lot of modern historical scholarship will say, well, the gospel kind of went there probably with individuals that weren't very well known. It's just that because people were moving around, so that's how come there was a church there for Paul to go to. But Paul doesn't say that. In his mind, that isn't somebody else has laid a foundation, because when he turns up and finds little groups of John the Baptist's disciples, he doesn't say, "Oh, John the Baptist planted this, I've got a hands off." I know John the Baptist is dead, but you hear what I'm saying. He just sees, no, this is fair game to draw together and give proper teaching to. But when he writes to the Roman church, he refers to the fact that somebody has already planted them. And so actually that ties in with the early church tradition that it was Peter who's gone to Rome, and he first goes to Rome after he gets out from prison supernaturally. He goes to John Mark's house, and at that point it says he went to another place, and it doesn't tell us where. Now, why doesn't it tell us where? Well, do you remember what I said about probably the final version of Luke came together as part of Paul's defense? And actually, the riots caused by Jesus, which are recorded, do you remember that the Jews get kicked out of Rome because of riots on account of someone called Christus? And pretty much every historian, whether secular or Christian, recognises that Christus is just a misunderstanding of Christus. And so the last thing Luke would want to do when he's writing the book of Acts is say when Peter leaves Jerusalem, he went up to Rome and started the church that caused all that trouble, that caused the riots because of Christus. Do you see? So he leaves it out. You get the kind of the story I'm telling. But anyway, that's John Mark. So he's gone with Peter up there. He may have been the young man in Gethsemane. Let's keep going. Papias tells us about Mark. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately. See, so interpreter, what does he mean by that? Well, if he is going out into the Greek-speaking world, and Peter would definitely speak Greek because everyone had to, but it's not his comfortable language. It's not the one he's really, really easy with. If Mark is slightly better educated, you see, well, I'll travel with you. I'll open the doors. We'll get there. Maybe Mark even speaks Latin. That's an extra kind of extra benefit and layer. No reason why Peter would have learnt Latin, even though, of course, because actually the common language of the empire was Greek, not Latin. But if you're going to Rome, maybe you do need someone to do that. So he remembered not, and it says, and he wrote accurately everything he remembered Peter preaching. And it says, not indeed in order. Well, that's important, because when we're going to put together the story of Jesus' life, we're going to actually take the order predominantly from Luke and John, not from Mark or Matthew. And here we're being told that Mark wasn't trying to get the order right. He was just trying to get each story to be as much of the detail as possible. Does that make sense? So what we're going to find is that, and Matthew organises his material thematically. We're going to see that, rather than, and I told you about the then is actually a thematic then rather than a chronological then. So we're going to find the order of Jesus' story comes from Luke and punctuated by information from John, and that actually gives us a really good flow where we actually see Jesus going backwards and forwards from north to south and then circling around in Galilee, which you don't get just from Matthew and Mark on their own, because you don't get the same movement of geography and time which you get from the other two. But anyway, so it says Mark didn't do anything wrong by writing down what he did. He was writing down single points as he remembered them. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing that he had heard and to make no false statements in them. And if you compare Mark's accounts and Matthew's accounts, which I had those slides earlier but we didn't stop and look at them, you get loads of the things we take for granted in a story aren't included in Matthew's gospel, but the detail comes from Mark, because it's Mark that tells us things, like as I said, the making of the mud and putting it on the eyes. We get that kind of eyewitness detail from Mark's gospels much more than we get from Matthew's. So Irenaeus says, after their, which is Paul, I've had this quote already, Peter and Paul, after their death or departure, and it's that ambiguous word he uses. Mark, who's the disciple and interpreter of Peter, had on his preaching to us in written form, and I put the note there to say that doesn't preclude the fact that he may have written it already. It's just saying even after they were gone in Rome, we still had it because of Mark. So we get that testimony there. Clement of Alexandria, and the place here is now interesting. He's writing around the middle of the 2nd century.
We haven't got some of these, Chris, in the notes, actually. Quite a lot of these bits.
You've got them, have you?
No, we haven't got them under Mark. No.
Not even the quotes?
We've only got a little bit from Papias and Jerome. That's it.
Is that right?
Yeah, it must have got missed out.
They must have got... Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. Okay, well, when you reread them, that's a shame. I have to check. Well, it was one of those, when you kind of working late and rushed and trying to get something out. Yeah, okay, that's a real that is really frustrating. So,
we can sort that.
Oh well, can't do anything about it now.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay. So Clement of Alexandria. The gospel according to Mark came about in this way. So, I like this bit, yeah, sorry. When Peter had preached in Rome, the word at Rome, those present asked Mark, or exhorted Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered what had been spoken, to make a record of what was said. And he did this and distributed the gospel among them, and asked him. And when the matter came to Peter's knowledge, Peter neither strongly forbade it nor urged it. So, what we get from this statement is that Mark clearly had written his gospel while Peter is still alive, because Peter actually sees it and says it's okay, glad you did it, sort of thing. But actually, this now explains why Mark's gospel is less structured and is a kind of a rougher gospel. The logic, if you like, of modern theory is because it was written first as a rather scrappy document, whereas if you like, the testimony from the early church is simply that it wasn't kind of considered to be a complete structured novel. It was kind of just this. These are the notes. These are the things that Peter preached. These are the transcripts of his talks, and you can use them, if you like, in parallel. And that's where Mark's gospel comes into its own. If you use it in parallel with Matthew, you get the full story. So it kind of becomes an overlay with all the detail in it. So Mark, who's the follower of Peter, while Peter was publicly preaching in Rome, this is a bit, it's the same guy, Clement in Alexandria, in the presence of certain of Caesar's knights, was putting forward many testimonies concerning Christ. So Caesar's knights, that's the Praetorian Guard. Do you remember Paul writes to members of the Praetorian Guard who have become Christians? Do you remember that? In his letter. One of his ones, I can't remember which one it's in now, and they were putting forward many testimonies. They requested him, and so he wrote the things that had been spoken by Peter, and that is the gospel that is according to Mark. So we have a bit more detail here, that actually, not only that, it was Praetorian Guards that really wanted this. So probably that's why he didn't argue with them, he got it written down. But something to note here is this testimony is coming from Alexandria, because that is where Mark goes next. Mark leaves Rome and goes to Alexandria, taking his gospel with him. And here we have the testimony from Alexandria saying we know a little bit more about how it came about. It was the Praetorian Guard who were asking for it. And that fits with what we know of church history, that Mark is eventually martyred in Alexandria, having planted a church there, which as I say, yeah, so the early church writing university tells us that Mark is the first leader of the church in Alexandria, which is why the stories come from there. And he dies during Nero's reign, not first reign, doesn't come back. Still teaching at the Coptic church. I can't remember why I put this reference to Roman martyrology, but there's no reason for the church in Alexandria so the whole Coptic church roots itself back to Mark. Coming to Alexandria to plant a church. Here we go in Eusebius. The churches in Egypt and Alexandria itself did he, Simon, again, not by his own means, but by Mark, his disciple, erect. So Eusebius is telling us that the churches in that region were kind of, if you like, Peter oversighted sending Mark as a missionary, and that's the story we also get from the Coptic church. And in the 8th year of Nero, Annianus, who was the first after Mark the evangelist, received the charge of the diocese of Alexandria. Do you remember right at the beginning I said that they found a document of Mark's gospel in Alexandria from a death mask? See, Mark's gospel becomes important in Egypt because actually it is Mark who takes the gospel and establishes the church there. Taking the gospel which Mark himself had composed, he went to Egypt and formed a church. This is Jerome writing a bit later. He died in the 8th year of Nero and was buried at Alexandria. So Mark's gospel, Mark has actually died by the late 60s, if I put it that way, because so does Nero. He dies in the late 60s. So we kind of, if we're putting the timings together, you have to. That's actually normally why even today modern scholarship still recognises Mark. Latest it could have been written. Oh, sorry, not the latest. They say it must have been started by 65 because they're recognising that actually the tradition around Alexandria is so strong, and he seems to have died by about 68. So he must have been started his gospel before then. I think it was considerably before then. But you know the story. There's an interesting little confirmation about Mark's gospel. Have you got these, Phil? They're still missing.
Yeah.
We're getting there now. Okay. So the Gospel of Thomas is really interesting. Scholarship likes to see the Gospel of Thomas as being a really early document, but some say it's much, much later. You see that it's become very Gnostic, but probably originally it was a collection of sayings that probably were sayings of Jesus. But it became popular to be expanded and having new things added to it by people who were just kind of trying to endorse their own theories. But there's a document called the Gospel of Thomas, and in it, the saying number 13, it's kind of broken up into sayings. We have a little discussion. So Jesus says to his disciples, "Make comparison. Who am I like?" And so Simon Peter said to him, "You are a righteous angel." Now, Mark's gospel starts with the phrase about the angel. I'll quickly read it. We don't necessarily spot it in English. So here's Mark's beginning. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as written in Isaiah the prophet, "Behold, I send my messenger." And the word messenger is angelos. Behold, I'm sending my angel, you see. So Simon Peter says you're a righteous angel. You're the one that's bringing the message, effectively. Matthew said you're like a wise philosopher. And actually that captures Matthew's gospel. It's full of Jesus' detailed teaching, the philosophy of life. Much more than Mark's gospel, much more than Luke's. Is kind of, we see Jesus as the great teacher in Matthew's gospel. So and then Thomas said, "Master, my mouth is completely unable to say what you're like." So it's almost in this document that some scholars say goes right the way back to 40 AD, and probably that's too early, but an early document. We have a reference effectively to Simon Peter, who is seen as the author of Mark's Gospel, and Matthew, who's seen as the author of Matthew's gospel, and comparing them with Thomas, who is saying, and here's my gospel. Does that make sense? So you've got this little kind of witness or testimony of the two gospels already existing from an early stage and recognizing the shape of them. So we need to be speedy, and Luke is one of my favourites when we do this.
Nearly out of time, Chris, I'm afraid, but yeah, we've not got much time left.
No, that's why we get into Luke, because he's good, and then we'll finish.
Yeah.
So Luke wrote more of the New Testament than anybody else. He's obviously, we know him as a close travelling companion of Paul. He was really well educated, and so on. You can see all those things. But here's where it gets interesting. Because Origen tells us that Luke's gospel is being referred to. Do you remember I showed you that passage earlier? So the early church tells us that is the case. So it's not just that you can translate it that way, which you can, and is better than most modern translations that add extra words, but the early church actually tells us that's how it should be translated. That reference in Corinthians is a reference to Luke's gospel. Okay? And when it says we're sending along the one who's famous because of the gospel, and I've got the Greek word there so you can check it out in Strong's. And he goes on, and we find out more things about him. So it says Luke was a Syrian of Antioch, by profession a physician. He became a disciple of the apostles and later followed Paul until Paul's martyrdom. He served the Lord continuously and is unmarried without children. He's filled with the Holy Spirit, died at the age of 84. So that's the testimony in Boeotia. I don't know where that is, but somewhere. Although there were already Gospels in existence, so it's plural, so he's writing after Matthew and Mark, he, moved by the Holy Spirit, composed the whole Gospel in the district around Achaia. So he's we can actually trace that when we do it next time, where that is. The Moratorian Canon, which is, although our copy comes a bit later, it actually claims to be kind of the document originating in the 2nd century, tells us that the third book of the Gospels is according to Luke. He's the well-known physician. After the ascension, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken him with him for the law, he composed in his own name according to the general belief. So again, we're getting that testimony. I'm going to skip through a couple of things, but I want to focus on the main bits. Here, I've got a little bit of confusion, which is going to unravel. Here's Adamantius is a kind of a code name for Origen. So this is probably written by Origen. And he has this kind of debate, which is a kind of a common way they used to write. They'd set up two characters and they'd have a debate to kind of illustrate theology. So Eutropius asks the question, how many disciples did Christ have? And Adamantius says he had 12, and afterwards 72, who he sent out to preach the gospel. Mark and Luke were among the 72, along with Paul preached the gospel. So in this kind of dialogue, Mark and Luke are both put as members of the 72 disciples, which is I like. It means, in fact, all of the gospel writers kind of were part of the phases of Jesus' ministry. Does that make sense? And of the 72, others were others as well to preach. This is a guy called Epiphanius, who is a Syrian scholar, I think, writing in the 4th century. He talks about the 72, and he names them. He kind of gives us a few more names, and he mentions first of all Mark and Luke, and I've got them highlighted there. And then he names other people who we can see in the New Testament. Justus is the man who is almost picked as an apostle to replace Judas, if you remember. Matthias, who is the one who is chosen. Barnabas, who we know. Apelles and Rufus, both of those people are greeted by Paul's letter to the Romans. Niger, Niger is named before someone called Lucius of Cyrene. He's a leader of the Antioch church, so he's in this list, and the rest of the 72. So he gives us some of these characters that we find in the New Testament just as names. What he's telling us is they were actually part of that wider discipleship group, which can make sense, doesn't it? So yeah, there we go. I've got a bit more detail. The thing you'll often hear though is that that can't be true because Luke wasn't Jewish. See? And the logic for Luke not being Jewish, he couldn't have been part of the 72. The early church got it wrong, is because in Colossians, Paul makes this statement. He says, in Jesus, who is called Justus, they were the only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are from the circumcision. And then he goes on and he starts listing some other people. So people say, well, Paul says these are the only ones who were Jews from the circumcision before he lists Luke. So Luke can't be Jewish. See the logic? But it's not really strong, because actually that phrase from the circumcision is used by Paul to mean various things. And what it can probably means is Christians who are strongly of the sect of you must get circumcised to be a Christian. So what he's actually saying is the only ones from that sect, from that group, were these two, but these are the other people. And because actually Luke, Epaphras, who he puts next to Luke, does seem to be Jewish, because Paul sent him to plant the church, and Paul always starts his church planting by going to the synagogue first. But more importantly, what you find is that Paul gets into trouble for bringing a Gentile into Jerusalem and into the temple at a time when Luke is with him, but Luke is not that Gentile. You see the logic? So if you're saying that Luke is a Gentile, how come it's not Luke that he's in trouble for bringing into Jerusalem and the temple? So it says, and we had come to Jerusalem, this is Paul talking, and Paul went in with us. So remember, Luke is writing Acts, and he's writing about, and normally it's Paul taking the lead. We come to Jerusalem, he's with Paul. But now, here's really interesting, Paul goes in to meet the apostles, and he goes in with us. It's not we went in with Paul to meet them. Do you see the difference? And actually, if the early church is correct, because Luke is one of the 72, he knows the apostles, Paul doesn't. So Paul, on this occasion, unusually in the book of Acts, is no longer us going with Paul, it's Paul coming with us. So you're beginning to see a picture where Luke looks like he really has been one of Jesus' disciples, and he is known to the apostles in Jerusalem. And we get the thing, he even brought Greeks into the temple because they had seen Trophimus with him. So Paul is doing all this stuff with Luke, but no one's saying Luke's a Gentile. So I'm just kind of trying to discredit that logic that says Luke can't be one of the 72. The early church must have got it wrong, because Paul calls him not of the circumcision. I'm going to skip through, but you can look at those little the slides there, because I don't want to be too, because I want to get on to seeing Luke is actually a character we get a lot of information about when we realise it, because Origen tells in his commentary on Romans that Lucius, who is called Paul's kinsman, is actually Luke the evangelist. So Origen tells us that when Paul writes in Romans about Lucius, he is talking about Luke. But scholarship rejected that, because they said, no, Luke is short for the Greek name Lucanos, not for Lucius. And they were adamant about that. Absolutely, totally knew the truth. The only problem is they archaeologically dug up a tablet, nice piece of stone. Have I got that on this slide? Yeah, the Men Askenos sanctuary. They dig up a reference to a Greek man called Lucius, who is then sometimes called Luke. So obviously, although modern scholarship knows that Lucius can't be Luke, the ancient world wasn't quite so sure of that. So we're suddenly, because actually Lucius appears at several points in the New Testament story. He's not as invisible to us, he's not as unknown to us as we think he is. Ephraim of Syria, again, is another early church writer, says that Saul and Barnabas, who carried food to the saints in Jerusalem, you remember that, they come down, returned with John, who was called Mark, and so did Luke of Cyrene. But both of these are evangelists and wrote before the discipleship of Paul. So he refers to the Luke of Cyrene, because there is a Lucius of Cyrene, and Lucius, my kinsman, in Romans, Origen tells us is Luke, who wrote the Gospel. You see, they're all connecting together. Because what did Lucius of Cyrene do? Well, he was a friend of Niger, who is also a leader at the Church of Antioch, and who also comes from Cyrene. So the Lucius of Romans is probably the Lucius of Acts. So it says, now there were in the church that was in Antioch certain prophets and teachers. There's Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene and Manaen, and so on. So suddenly, Luke, who we see suddenly pops into the story of the book of Acts and becomes Paul's documenter, is part of the leadership that oversights the young Paul's development and commissions him to go on his mission. Do you see that? Because that Lucius of Cyrene is Luke the evangelist. For the scriptures, and we got the quote, sorry, I've had that, where Paul quotes him. So I think in my skipping around, I've missed the fact that, of course, we read about men from Cyrene who went to Antioch and they took the gospel with him. So actually, Lucius of Cyrene is probably he has left Jerusalem. He is probably a Hellenized Jew because his name is Luke. And as the pressure grows, the Hellenized Jews are right at the heart of it. They're the ones that kill Stephen the martyr, and they get into various arguments. And so the Hellenized Jews start to leave. So men of Cyrene come up to Antioch. They bring the gospel with them. They plant the church. Paul, when he eventually gets settled up there, he gets taken up by Barnabas, is kind of therefore under their development. Lucius of Cyrene is therefore part of the leadership that is praying, and the Holy Spirit says, set apart for me Paul and Barnabas. He is therefore one of those who's laid hand on Paul, commissioned him out. And then halfway through the story of the book of Acts, where it's been talking to what Paul does, it suddenly starts talking about what we did. It looks like at some point that same church leader has come and joined Paul on his missionary journeys. As he gets to Achaia and near Ephesus, he stops travelling with him and takes time to write down the gospel, because he was a part of the 72 that took the thing out in the first place. Is that all making sense? So we're finally getting on to the last one. We're nearly done, Phil. Don't worry. John, I'm going to do this really quick. John, in John's gospel itself, he seems to acknowledge the other gospels. You remember, at the end of his gospel, he says, "Now Jesus performed many other miraculous signs in the presence of the disciples, which aren't recorded in this book." In other words, I know there's other ones out there, but what you get from that statement is that what I've chosen to tell you the story of are stories you won't have read elsewhere. He kind of explains why his view of Jesus is so different. I'm deliberately telling you stories which you haven't seen previously, is the way that John's Gospel puts it. And we're told that, in the Moratorian canon, which again traces itself back to the 2nd century, that the 4th Gospel is the Gospel of John, who is one of his disciples. And his fellow disciples and bishops had been urging him to write, and they said fast. They prayed and fasted together, and they decided that instead of writing collaboratively, that John should write a new gospel, and that they should sign off on it and kind of authenticate it, and they should review it. And we find that kind of tied up in the evidence in John's gospel itself, because he then says the disciple who testified these things has written these things. See, that's what they said. And then it says, and we. So who's the we here? Well, according to the Moratorian canon from the 2nd century, that they were the group that, as they prayed together, it's kind of like we're getting to a stage, and we're going to see it next time, we're getting to a stage where suddenly the apostles are beginning to die. And Peter is almost certainly dead at this point. He's been executed. So's Paul. So it's getting towards the late 60s, and as they kind of gather together, it's kind of like there is more to be said about Jesus than we've ever told before. We need to get a new gospel together. Should we do it together? I tell you what, by the Holy Spirit, he said, set apart John. He should write it. You should authenticate it. You should verify it. And we find that at the end of John's gospel. I wrote it, but we are all agreeing this is a good record. The story itself is stories that you haven't heard before. We've given you a different perspective. It's now safer to tell some of these stories because it's later in the day than in the 40s and 50s when there was a lot of pressure. It's now the 60s, so it's safer to talk about them. We can tell you about some of the things that happened in Jerusalem that you haven't heard before. Does that make sense? That's what's going on. Now we find out though about John, which is really interesting, in an article that was defending the date of Easter, because remember, some of you will notice the date seems to be slightly different in John to the Synoptic Gospels. I won't explain that now. We'll do it when we come to it later on in the year. That we're told, he kind of runs through, he says of this, he's talking about the people that have been before him in the church. Philip, one of the 12. Moreover, John too, who leant back on the Lord's breast, who was a priest wearing the sacerdotal plate, both a witness and a teacher. By witness and a teacher, he means he wrote a gospel. He's a witness, and as a teacher, because he wrote letters to the church. And that John, who is the same one, he says, who leant back on the Lord's breast, was part of the church leadership of which I'm now a part, but a few generations ago. He was a priest. Not only was he a priest, he actually officiated, which is what wearing the sacerdotal plate means. Because Josephus tells us in 1st century Judea there were 6,000 priests, which is why if you weren't, unless you were an important priest, you got chosen by lot. And that's how John the Baptist's father, Zacharias, got chosen. He got picked out by lot, and you were lucky if you got chosen in your lifetime because there were so many priests. But what he's saying is that the John who wrote the gospel was a priest himself. So John the disciple, if it is the same person, which I believe it is, we're doing it quickly, is from a priestly family. But priestly families are so commonplace now, descendants of Aaron, that they all have to have their own jobs. So the fact he's a fisherman with a fishing business doesn't mean he's not a priest. Does that make sense? It just means he's not a very important priest. He's right down the bottom pile. But he can still get picked by lot, and that means he can officiate at some point. And it's saying that this John, who I believe here, there's some speculation, we've not got time to go into it, but is John the disciple, actually gets to officiate on one occasion, which gives you something of the flavour of how come John writes the gospel he writes. I put this little thing, there are various characters from the early church we know about, and the question is, are they one character, two characters, three, and so on? So they talk about John the Apostle, John the Disciple, John the Elder, and the Beloved Disciple. I think that John the Elder is probably a different John, because it's quite a common name, but I think that the Gospel writer and the disciple John are the same person, which is really interesting, because it seems that the disciple of Jesus, John, is actually Jesus' cousin. I haven't put a slide in here, but we'll do it definitely when we get to the when we're looking at the Jesus' last week. Do you remember James and John? Because we read at the cross, there's a list of the women that are there, and in one gospel we're told that Mary's sister is there, in another gospel that person is called Salome, and in the third gospel she's referred to as the mother of James and John. So you put those things together, and it would seem that James and John are actually cousins of Jesus. You say, well, how can they be priests if they're cousins of Jesus? He is a Nazarite, but that's not difficult, because remember Elizabeth, who's also a cousin of Mary, is actually from the house of Levi. It's just that she's married someone who's, or the family has kind of divided at some point, but her sister is married a Levite. They're obviously close, if I can put it that way. So getting to the end, sorry it's a bit waffly at the end there, but can you see the picture we've got of the different characters? Matthew, who seems to be selected by Jesus to be the original writer down of the, if you like, the authorized version of Jesus' story, and he writes it down in a very generic way to be used in the church, even by people who weren't there when it happened. Then along comes Mark, who captures Peter telling the story. When Peter tells the authorized stories, he tells them with eyewitness detail, because he really was there. So he knows those details. So Mark is doing that, and he supplements, if you like, the stories from Matthew with that eyewitness detail. Luke, who has actually come into the ministry of Jesus as part of the 72, and has travelled and has travelled up to Antioch in the first wave of people to leave Jerusalem and get up to Antioch, plant the church there. He therefore has discipled Paul, so he becomes Paul's historian. But to aid Paul's mission, he takes the source documents that he's had. Probably at this stage he's got a copy of Mark's Gospel and maybe of Matthew's as well, and he brings his own knowledge and his own relationships and produces a more Greek Gospel for the church up there around the Aegean Sea. And then as the persecution kicks in, the execution of Peter and of Paul in Rome probably kicks up a phase where they say, do you know what, there's lots that we could have said and we've always we haven't done it so far. Let's kind of commission the last document. Let's commission John's Gospel. John writes it. So those who were alive and who saw the events sign off and say, yes, this is a true witness. And so we have the four Gospels. Phew! And I apologise whoever asked me to slow down, because I didn't listen to you at all.